And we left off on page 192, I think it was, last week, or week before last, in the book on devil worship. And we're in a particular area here and just seeing where some of the origins of these things are, the holidays of Christianity, and we're actually seeing how these actually tie into fertility rites and fertility rituals. We see bits and pieces of these different fertility rites and fertility rituals, throughout the different customs of Christmas, Easter, all of these things, and even the time of year that these things are taking place, coincides with the actual with the pagan rites that were taking place at that time. We also saw how how there was actually what they considered, what the pagans considered to be sacred prostitution, where people would actually, young women especially, would offer their virginity to these gods. Let me see here. And just how we're seeing and we're learning just how much these rites were their fertility rites, and just how much unlawful sex acts and things like that are involved with these things, and it's things that's lost in the world. They don't see these things. They at Easter time they see cute little bunnies with egg. You see eggs and rabbits and things like that, but yet they try to disguise that as the worship of the resurrection of the Savior. Well, what in the world does Easter eggs, colored eggs, and rabbits have to do with the resurrection of the Savior? What does it have to do with salvation? Absolutely nothing. But it does have to do, and it has everything to do with the ancient fertility rites that were being done at that time. And they were actually, they would take place, at specific times of the year. There's a let's see here. Let's see on page 191 here. It showed here how these things are still practiced today. How, like in Hungary, to this day, girls are sprinkled with water on Easter Monday. In exchange, they give young men Easter eggs, cookies with nuts and flowers. All of these are ancient fertility symbols, and these things are practiced, and people don't understand why they practice them. But they just do. They view them, and we're going to see as we get into it a little bit more today. They say, they look at it as just harmless things for the children. Well, teaching the children to do these things, teaching children to violate the laws of Yahweh, to set these things aside and to practice these things, is actually something that we're going to start off with here this evening. But that actually has to do with passing the children through the fire to the god Molech. And we'll see here in just a minute how all that takes place. But if you remember, one of the things here that I kind of like to reiterate and keep in mind. I've got this scripture marked, but it's in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 29 to 32. And it shows here in verse 30, it shows us to be careful, and it's a warning that is given to us, and we need to pay particular attention to this. It says, "Be careful not to be ensnared into following them by asking about their gods." Talking about these gods that, talking about the gods in the land. Be careful about do not be ensnared into following them by asking about their gods, or Elohim, saying, "How do these nations serve their gods? I will also do the same." Yahweh tells us very, very clearly in verse 31, you must not worship Yahweh your Father in their way. And you can see through the practices and through the things that are being done, through the different traditions of these holidays, that this law is blatantly being broken. They take something that was given to a god, that was done in honor of a god, and they say, well, we'll just Christianize it. We'll just Christianize it, and then it'll be okay. Well, Yahweh tells us very clearly we can't do that. And he says here, for every abomination to Yahweh, he said, you must not worship Yahweh your Father in their way, for every abomination to Yahweh which he hates, they do to their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. And we're going to get into that here and see what that entails. And if you remember, just finishing up over here on page 192, toward the bottom over here, it says, In the round of holidays celebrated in ancient fertility sex worship, the fertility mother was impregnated by her fertility husband/son in order to ensure fertility for the material wealth of pagan man. This sex rite of spring took place around the time of the vernal equinox. Okay, and then at the same time of year, illicit sexual relations were rampant in the ancient pagan sex temples, and we read a little bit about that last week. Now, at the pagan holiday celebrated around the time of the winter solstice, the same mother gave birth to her reborn God son, who was reborn in order to become her husband. So the son that she gave birth to later along the line actually becomes her husband. And then at the following vernal equinox. And during this time of the year, the pages of history are filled with episodes of parents actually sacrificing their firstborn babies to Molech by burning them up. So this was actually something that was done. You know, it was this round of perversion which had been celebrated from pagan antiquity through this day. It is not the worship of Yahweh that has been practiced. Today, due to the fact that these same pagan holidays are still celebrated, the two greatest of them are now known as Easter and Christmas. The two greatest festivals of the Christian calendar, Easter and Christmas. With almost the same pagan rites: sun worship, eggs, rabbits, lilies, flowers, evergreen trees, Bacchus balls, these are tree ornaments, good luck gifts, sex worship. And it should be no surprise, or Pastor Assery says, should it be a surprise to anyone that the mind of the modern religious man is depraved? So subtle has the introduction of sex been through the mass media, television, advertising, radio, movies, that now the gyrations that regularly performed and watched have been accepted as the norm. You know, and we've heard pastors speak of that. We've heard him talk about that, of how these things have actually changed throughout history, and it hasn't been really that long. You know, I think we mentioned last week, last time we had mentioned how married couples were actually portrayed what was it, back in the 60s? You know, they were portrayed as sleeping in separate beds. They weren't even allowed to sleep in the same bed. You know, but now, when you see things when things are shown on television, now anything goes. I mean, there's absolutely nothing left to the imagination whatsoever. I mean, every evil thing is depicted in graphic detail. So you can see, I mean, just, you know, with the increase in knowledge, you also see the increase in depravity of how mankind's morals have just, you know, have gone to nothing. I mean, they're non-existent. There aren't any morals in the world today except what comes forth from Yahweh's house and comes forth from the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program. That's the only set of morals that are in this world. But it says there's not enough to hurt the sea. It says, there are pockets of resistance as concerned parents decry the depravity which is portrayed, but there are not enough of them to hurt the wallets of the advertisers, and that's what it comes down to. It comes down to the love of money. And what has been the end result? This whole world has become completely insane because of this idolatry. You know, there's no rational thought. I mean, you can see. I mean, people don't think straight out in the world at all. Pass through to Molech. Here we see on page 193. It says the little children in this world are initiated into God worship from birth. From birth. You know, what takes place on their first year of birth? After their birth, what do they have? They have a big old birthday party, complete with cakes and candles and everything else. Why? Why is it? That child's too young to know what in the world is going on. They're just there. But they're being indoctrinated, just as the parents have been indoctrinated. It is a fact that this world is passing their children through the fire to Molech simply because the children are encouraged to celebrate the pagan holidays, which are a tradition in today's society. You see how easy it is to pass your children through the fire to the god Molech? It's simply to introduce them, to teach them these traditions. And because they are taught God worship, they are actually dedicated to the service and worship of the God of this world, to Satan the adversary, to Satan the devil. It says, from the Encyclopedia Judaica, volume 12, pages 230 to 232, we find out these facts about the cult of Molech. It says, evidence concerning Molech worship in the ancient Israel is found in the legal as well as the historical and prophetic literature of the Bible. Most testimonies of the Pentateuch, which seem to be the most ancient and therefore are the most reliable ones, should be divided according to the formulation of the law into two groups. The Holiness Code, which speaks about giving or passing children through to Molech, and we see that in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21. And then looks like 20, verse 2, 3, and 4. What laws are spoken of there in Leviticus 18? Right, it's the laws concerning proper conduct between men and women, proper conduct, proper sexual conduct. It's interesting to note that that is listed in here. And then in the law, in Deuteronomy, which speaks of passing one's own son or daughter through the fire. It says the nature of the worship, as already indicated above, the legal and historical sources speak about passing the children to Molech in fire. According to the rabbinic interpretation, this prohibition against passing the children through the fire and then delivering them to the pagan priests. In other words, according to this interpretation, this refers to an initiation rite. This is an initiation or consecration is what it is. But notice here, they would actually deliver them to the pagan priests. You know, we see you see this in the churches today. You see this in the world today. I mean, people will take their children and drop them off at Sunday school, where they are taught what? They're taught God worship. They're taught the worship of Sunday. They're taught that Jesus came and did it all for them. They're taught Christmas. They're taught Easter. They're taught all of these abominations that strictly go against the laws of Yahweh. They're being taught war because they're not being taught the laws of peace. On page 194 over here, it says in Leviticus 18 and 20, the common denominator of all of these traditions is the understanding of Molech worship as the transfer of children to paganism by either delivering them directly to pagan priests or by procreation through intercourse with a pagan woman. This tradition, which could hardly be an invention, is now corroborated by the evidence in certain Assyrian documents. This is supported by the fact that in some cases it is explicitly specified that the offender will dedicate his sons as priests to a dad and his daughter as Herodules to Ishtar. And we know Ishtar, that ties in with Easter, right? Now look what Pastor explains here. He says, if any child whatsoever, regardless of the religion in which they are being raised, if they are being taught to worship God or Lord, El, Elohim, Allah, Adonai, then they have been dedicated to the gods. Okay, it's that simple. If they're taught to worship God or Lord, if they're taught to worship anyone but Yahweh, then they have been dedicated to the gods. Digressing here, I would ask you to reread chapter 1 of this series, just what is devil worship, who is God, and the Elo, his source, which proves who God actually is. The word God has nothing to do with the Creator, who is Yahweh. Remember, the word God or El or Elohim was actually synonymous with demons. It could be transposed with demons, either a demon singular or demons plural. It says, therefore, the sad fact is that almost every child in this world has been dedicated to God. And because they have been given over to pagan representatives to be taught, they are assuredly learning to accept and appreciate the same disgusting, vile, perverted sex acts which have been taught since the dawn of ancient paganism. You know, they're being taught those traditions. How can these children help but learn these disgusting practices? Yes, most of them have even been sent to church to learn them. Fornication, adultery, homosexuality, child molesting, incest, rape, murder. And notice the last one, war. Okay, the sun phallic symbol erected at every temple of sex here it shows, Pastor shows. He says, look on the top of nearly any church in America, and indeed throughout the world, and you will see an obelisk or a pole that's erected there. Okay, you ever wonder why that pole is there or that steeple is there? Should you ask the average churchgoer what this actually represents, they will give you their guess, or they will simply have to admit that they have no idea. However, the truth about this abomination is shocking. I would have you know that erected upon almost every church in the world today is the representative of the god and goddess which is actually worshipped in the bowels of this building. These edifices are modernly called church steeples, but they are originally phallic symbols of ancient paganism. Okay, from the International Standard Encyclopedia, Volume 3, we find this information about the obelisk. An obelisk here, it shows it's a sacred pillar. It says it's appropriately rendered obelisk in view of the Egyptian context. Here it says Beth Shemesh, or the house of the sun, is no doubt the Egyptian city of Yenu, the city of the column, called by the Greeks Heliopolis, the city of the sun. The Septuagint calls that the pillars of Heliopolis, which are in On, O-N. It says, located northeast of Cairo, Heliopolis was the center of the sun god Ra. Okay? You heard about the hidden god Amun-Ra? Okay? The sun god Ra. It says Heliopolis was the center of this sun god. That's where he resides, the house of Ra. Now, it says, according to the Heliopolitan theology, the obelisk symbolized the primeval hill at the beginning of creation. It became the symbol of the sun god, guaranteeing life and prosperity to the pharaohs. It says the Romans removed many of these Egyptian obelisks for their own use, as well as erecting some new ones. The best known example of an obelisk shape in America is, of course, anybody know? Resides in Washington, D.C. Praise Yahweh, the Washington Monument. And continuing on here, it says, reading on volume 6, page 617 of Collier's Encyclopedia, we learned that one of the obelisks were transported to America, to Central Park in New York City, and one was sent to London, England, on the embankment of the Thames River, not far from the British Houses of Parliament, and this was known as Cleopatra's Needle. And that resides in New York, in Central Park, and this is a photograph. This is a photograph of Cleopatra's Needle. Okay? And it's kind of hard to see, and it's kind of hard to see there in that picture. But if you look, let me see if I can zoom in on it here. You see those markings that are on it? These markings and stuff here. Okay, those are Egyptian hieroglyphs. That's the Egyptian writing. So this is one of those. This is one of those that came from Heliopolis. It says Cleopatra's Needles, the two obelisks of red seen granite, which were erected at Heliopolis, Egypt, more than 3,300 years ago. One of the obelisks now stands in New York, the other on the Thames embankment in London. And these obelisks originally were placed at Heliopolis before the Temple of the Sun. Remember, this was in honor of that sun god of that sun god Ra. Now, let me see here. I've got here's another. This is another picture. They're trying to do some restoration work on it, I guess, but you can see maybe a little bit clearer picture of some of those carvings and stuff, those hieroglyphs that are on that particular obelisk. But it says in 14 BC they were carried to Alexandria by Caesar Augustus, and from there they were transported as gifts of Ismail Pasha of Egypt to England and to the United States in 1878 and 1880, respectively. And then it goes on here. It shows here that its sides are covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions from Ramses II and Thutmose III. There's no known connection between Cleopatra's Needles and Cleopatra herself. But again, this is, you can see the writings there, the hieroglyphs there. It says, just as we have read from this source, these obelisks were originally placed at Heliopolis in front of the temple of the sun, and these are the sun symbols, and they are sex symbols here, it shows. Okay, under this word obelisk here in a dictionary of symbols, it says obelisk. It says a symbol of the sun ray by virtue of its shape. Because of its substance, it is bound up with the general symbolism of stone. It is further related to the myths of solar ascension and of light as the penetrating spirit, in consequence of its upright position and the pyramidal point at which it terminates. And so here again, on the same reference, we find that it's a symbol of the phallus. And it shows here a symbol for the perpetuation of life, the active power, and the propagation of cosmic forces, it shows here. But this obelisk, this sacred stone pillar, is a symbol which represents the male sex member of the god which is worshipped. Okay, and that's what it represents. The Asherah, the sacred wooden pole, is the phallic symbol which represents the female sex member of the goddess which is worshipped. And we're going to see where these are actually used in combination here in just a minute. It says these representations are pointed upward toward the sun. And as the symbol of the phallus, this position obviously has affected and influenced the minds of its worshippers since antiquity. The stone pillar and sacred pole were placed at the entrance to the pagan temples to represent the worship, to represent worship, which was and is actually practiced therein. And as we have read here, Pastor shows here, the Romans removed many Egyptian obelisks for their own use. Today, this image of jealousy is erected directly in front of the entrance to, now see if anybody recognizes this place here. Anybody recognize that? Where is that? That's St. Peter's Square. That's St. Peter's in Rome. And so you can see the obelisk that is there. And I thought what was pretty interesting about this, the representation down here of the missile, which is the end result of this God worship. What's sitting on top of this missile down over here? Right, Constantine's sword, right? By this sign conquer. Look at here. What's on the top of this obelisk? There you go. See that? I just thought that was pretty interesting. Here's another site, just another view of it here. And again, you can see the obelisk that is there, but you also see the representation here of one of the popes, it looks like. And you can see the distinctive mitre hat that he has there. It kind of looks like a fish head, we know where that actually is comes from the worship of Dagon. So you can so we can see that and see how the God worship ties in with that there also. We've got that one here, and here's another picture, and this is actually taken. It looks like this picture is actually taken from back up over here, looking back this way. And let's see here. And so you can kind of see the gods. You can see the gods standing there looking out over St. Peter's Square there. And then remember Pastor talked about, and I just mentioned here, it mentioned you had that obelisk in the middle, this big obelisk here, which represents, which represents the male. And remember what they said represented the female, right? With these smaller pillars. Well, look what's surrounding. You see what's surrounding the base of this thing? All the way around there. You see those little pillars all the way around? That's what those are representative of. Those represent that Asherah. That represents the female. That represents the female of the female goddess. So we can see there. So you can see just what is exactly worshipped there on the seven hills of Rome. But it shows here, it says, today the image of jealousy is erected directly in front of the entrance to St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. St. Peter's Church is supposedly the mother church of all Christianity, and right before it, an obelisk is erected, a symbol of the sun and of the phallus, it shows here. And it says the accompanying diagram shows how the cross shape of St. Peter's Cathedral itself is architecturally designed, and we find the obelisk, the pagan obelisk itself, situated in the center of this court, then completely surrounded by these sacred poles. And that's kind of what we saw. That was what we saw here just a few seconds ago. Again, that's that picture. That's that picture there, and then you can kind of see that there. And then it also shows here that St. Peter's itself is actually architecturally designed in the shape of a cross. And when you look at it from a top view, so you can see St. Peter's Square. You can kind of see the confusion in the mind there because, I don't know, but that shape isn't a square to me. I mean, that's round, or oval at least. But the obelisk will sit right in the middle here, and then you have the entrance to the cathedral, St. Peter's itself. Look at the shape here look at the shape of St. Peter's. You see this? You see that shape? It's in the shape of a cross. And then from the same reference here, Pastor shows us, on volume 1, page 268, we find the ancestor of the church steeple is an ancient Babylon church, is ancient Babylon. Church towers and spires which reached high in development in Gothic times date back to a much earlier period. Perhaps it says here to Old Babylonian Tower Temple, which was the ancestor of the steeple. In Christian countries, they were first built separate from the churches. And then it shows here, like in Romanesque times, they had been important parts of the church itself. It says this tower or temple was a symbol which simply represented the Tower of Babylon, or the Tower of Babel. And I believe, if I remember right, it was in the Gulf War series where Pastor talked about the Tower of Babel. And how it wasn't a tower that reached up into the heavens. That's not what it was. Because it wouldn't have any purpose, but it was actually talking about. It actually talked about a system that was set up. I think, if I remember right, Pastor mentioned as like a geopolitical system, a combination of church and state. But from the two Babylons here, it shows here. From the two Babylons by Alexander Hislop on pages 30 and 31. It shows here let me see, I'm just going to hit kind of the reason he says why the statue of Sybil wore a crown of towers was because she first erected them in cities. The first city in the world after the flood from whence commenced the world itself was often dated, had towers encompassing walls, was Babylon. And Semiramis then was the first deified queen of that city, whose tower whose top was intended to reach heaven, must have been the prototype of which the goddess who first made the towers and the deities. And we're going to see here how this is actually pictured, in Diana of Ephesus. But here in we'll just go ahead and I'll show you this picture of Diana, this goddess here. This Diana, a representation of her. And you can kind of see the different carvings and stuff that are on her, and then you see these symbols here, these fertility symbols here, and then on her head you see the representation of this Tower of Babel. And it shows here that says, in general, Diana was depicted as a virgin, and and the patroness of virginity. But the Ephesian Diana was quite different. She represented with all the attributes of the mother of the gods, and as the mother of the gods, she wore a turreted crown. And so we can kind of see that when that represented that Tower of Babel. Now, if you remember from Unger's Bible Dictionary, that gives us a little bit, and this is what Pastor read from. This is what he read from when he was teaching this during with the Gulf War series. But it's on page 114 of Unger's Bible Dictionary, and it shows here that this tower Babelov, and it shows the building which the Babel builders intended to construct and which had become the symbol of their God-defying disobedience and pride. So this is what it symboled. It was symbolizing this disobedience. And it shows here, it says it denotes a sacred temple tower and means a pinnacle. And Pastor, he showed in that series how that actually it was representation of these church steeples. And, when you picture that church steeple, of course, it's that pointy thing, that pointy structure that sits up there. And he shows here, and he explained here and pointed out of Unger's Bible Dictionary here, it shows, and despite the fact of divine judgment on the first, the more than 24 such later these temples or ziggurats are an imitation of the first to an extent and appear to constitute an attempt to avert any possibility of divine punishment by consecrating them to the guardians or to the gods or the goddesses of the city. And we'll be getting into some of those here. Yahweh willing, we'll get into it this evening here in a couple of pages here when we're talking about domestic and community spirits, ancestral spirits, and demonology, and how they actually dedicated their cities to that. But the idea behind the pastor pointed out in that series on the Gulf War, he showed us, that the idea was that they could go run into these churches, and that the wrath that would pour down from heaven, the wrath that would pour down, in their terms, their terminology, the wrath or the punishment that would come down from Yahweh would be averted because it would all be pushed away because of the way the steeple was actually constructed, and it would just kind of like water, I guess, kind of like a major downpour. They would be protected. But that was the idea, and that's how like I said, that's how Pastor explained that to us. But these peoples, the scriptures show, they can go into the rocks, they can go to their temples, they can go hide, but their gods, their gods are not going to protect them. Their gods cannot protect them. The obelisk, Pastor shows here on page 199, the obelisk, the sacred stone pillar, is the phallic symbol which represents the male sex member of the god which he worshipped. And the Asherah, the sacred wooden pole, is the phallic symbol which represents the female sex member of the goddess which is worshipped. And these representations are pointed upward toward the sun, and as the symbol of the sun and the phallus, this position has emphatically, subconsciously influenced the minds of its worshipers since antiquity. And it says, these things which now adorn most every Christian church in this world were directly borrowed from the layouts of pagan temples. According to Compton's Pictured Encyclopedia, Michelangelo built a portion of the Church of the Popes, partially his own design, and both partly following the plans of the predecessor, Bramante. Both of these men were under the influence of the Renaissance, which influence was responsible for the St. Peter's Church being modeled after the Greek and Roman buildings. Those church steeples and towers are just a modified form of an obelisk and Asherah, these symbols of male and female sex members, which are actually unspoken symbols of the sex worship which is actually being taught in the buildings so decorated. Okay. Usually, on page 200 here, usually on top of these modern churches of paganism, these symbols reach up to the sun. Within these within these buildings, pagan preachers are vomiting forth the filth and abomination of sun worship to all the initiated children within, preaching every pagan holiday to them. And because of this preaching has gone forth, it has resulted in all of this sex worship, which is blatantly practiced throughout all of this perverted world. The church steeple has nothing to do with the worship of the Creator. Has nothing to do with it. In fact, Yahweh inspired the prophet Zechariah to condemn the demon worship these sacred pillars and poles represent. In Zechariah 5, verse 4, it says, I will send out the curse. I will send the curse out, says Yahweh of hosts, and it will enter into the house of the thief and into the house of him who vows an oath with my name for the sake of falsehood. And the curse will remain in the midst of his house, and it will consume it together with the sacred poles and the stones measured off for desolation. It says there is no place in the Bible which this world claims to be following, not one scripture that tells anyone to use these symbols of worship of the Creator. There's nowhere that tells them to use these symbols at all. There is only condemnation written. Therefore, how can anybody possibly say they are worshiping the Creator while at the same time using these pagan symbols which represent the fertility, sun, sex, gods, and goddesses in their worship? Okay, so if that's not enough of what's going on, now we see here a little bit more about demonology and witchcraft, the practice of pagan magic rites. Okay, on page 200 here, it says, to the pagan mind, the gods and goddesses that he worshipped had to be dealt with. Now, to the pagan mind, the gods and goddesses he worshipped had to be dealt with. He had to manipulate them in order to make them give him the material wealth that he desired. Look at the thinking here that he had to manipulate these demons and these gods to give him what he wanted. He also had to appease them in order to protect himself. To accomplish these things, he used magic rites for this purpose. So that we may come to a clearer understanding of this concept, let us first read, Pastor shows us here from the Encyclopedia Judaica on page 1521 under demons and demonology. And it says here, a demon is an evil spirit or devil in the ordinary English usage of the term. This definition is, however, only approximate. In polytheistic religions, in other words, religions that worship more than one God, in polytheistic religions, the line between gods and demons is a shifting one. There are both good demons and gods who do evil. In monotheistic systems, evil spirits may be accepted as servants of the one God. So demonology is bound up with analogy and theology proper, or they may be elevated to the rank of opponents of God. Man, this is confusing. In which case their status as diabolic power differs from that of the demons of polytheism. Wow. Okay. In general, the notion of the demon in the ancient Near East was of a being less powerful than a god and less endowed with individuality. Whereas the great gods are accorded regular public worship, demons are not. They are dealt with in magic rites. So the demons were dealt with in magic rites, in individual cases of human suffering, which is their particular sphere. And then we see here the worship of the ancient and Near East centered around magic rites to appease and manipulate. It says demonology in the ancient and Near East, defense against evil spirits was a concern in Mesopotamia from the earliest times, beginning with the Sumerians, to whom much of the terminology connected with the demons may be traced. There is no qualitative difference between great gods and demons. In other words, they're one and the same. There's no difference. One name for a demon is an evil god. Demons, however, have less power, although occasionally myths depict them as rebelling against the great gods with some success. Incantations often list 4 or even 7 classes of demons. Demons are messengers of the Lord of the underworld and march before him. They live in deserts and near graves, and many of them are ghost spirits of the dead, especially those who have died by violence or were not properly buried. Sickness may be thought get this now, sickness may be thought of as caused by demonic possession, and some demons have the name of the specific disease they bring, thus headache or fever. Limmuwdyah is the hag who kills children in the womb and newborn babies. Like many other demons, she is depicted as a composite monster. In mythological texts from the Ugarit, the father of the gods, El, is frightened almost to death by a demon. Okay, the father of the gods, okay, the top one here, is frightened almost to death by a demon having 2 horns and a tail, like the devil in later representations. Phoenician amulet of the 7th century BCE shows, begins with an incantation, and it's intended to protect women in childbirth, and it goes on to invoke the protection of the gods and contains depictions of the demons mentioned, and a winged sphinx labeled Flying One, and a wolf devouring a child. So you see what they've done is they've attributed sickness and disease, they've attributed these curses to these supernatural forces rather than attributing them to disobedience to Yahweh. Okay, so they're blaming, basically what they're doing is they're blaming the troubles on somebody else instead of what they themselves are doing. That's what they're doing. They're passing the buck. Okay, Israel's official religion here, demonology in the Bible. If Israel's official religion contrasts sharply with the contemporary polytheisms and the role assigned to demons, which in the Bible is practically nil. Magic was prohibited among the Israelites from the very early times, for already the oldest collection of laws, the Book of the Covenant, contains the command, "You shall not tolerate a sorceress." Paul put the practitioners of necromancy out of the land, and since much of the pagan magic was protective, intended to keep demons away or to expel them, obviously Israel's religion aimed at a very radical extirpation of traffic with demons. Okay, so since much of the pagan magic was protective, it was intended to keep demons away. Well, the demons weren't the problem. It was the sins of the people. It was the violation and the pushing aside of the laws of Yahweh that were causing the pain and the suffering to come upon the people. In demonology here, it shows the science and the art of religious practice which pertains to supernatural beings called, from the Greek, demon spirits or genii. According to the type of demonology believed in, demons are human souls known as genii, ancestral spirits, incarnated ghosts, usually having evil intentions. Now, you go back to, you can trace this right back to what's written back there in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, where Eve is being tempted by Satan. And when Eve tells Satan, we're not to partake of this way of life or we will die. And then what did Satan tell her? Well, you're not going to die. You're just going to live forever. You have an immortal soul. So we see, this is where a lot of these things are stemming from, the belief of that immortal soul. And it ties back in with the ancient philosophies that we read about again. I know I keep going back to that, but you go back to the philosophies that we read about and we learned about there in Did Yahshua Messiah Pre-Exist? And you can see the bits and pieces of how this stuff came in and where it comes from. But it shows here, it says, a demon then is a human or animal enslaved or possessed by an evil spirit who, if remaining incorporeal, would be powerless to affect earthly creatures. The doctrine includes also the belief that life is controlled by spirits who belong to a hierarchy within which they are agents of one supreme spirit. So it says, all spirits are not malevolent. Those who engage in the management of inanimate nature may be either neutral or benevolent. Okay, magical influence. The intervention of spirits in the nature and in human affairs is made possible, according to demonology, by means of magic. This magic is employed by primitive peoples to prevent drought, to produce rain, to ward off disease or famine. By means of propitiation and spells, evil spirits may be diverted from their malevolent designs or pursuits. Among some primitive tribes, the path along which it is believed a demon will approach is barricaded with thorns, brushwood, odors, fire, or other obstacles. You might as well throw some garlic in there. Throw some garlic up there and put some holy water up there. Might as well throw all that up there too. See, epileptic fits and other kinds of seizures are occasions for the medicine man to apply rites of exorcism. To the primitive tribesmen, magic is the only available source of power whereby the attacks of demons may be averted or withstood. So you see, by these beliefs here have taken Yahweh completely out of the picture. Yahweh shows very clearly. We know that Yahweh is the only supreme. He is the only source of power in the universe. Okay, it is through Yahweh that the rains fall. It's through Yahweh that through the obedience to Yahweh that the rains fall like they should. That we don't experience sickness and disease. It's through our obedience to these things. But the people were taught, they have been taught to push aside these laws. And when these evil things were coming upon them, they, instead of blaming themselves and looking at the things that they were doing to bring these things upon themselves, they turned to this demonology and they turned to these magical influences. The types of spirits. Among the spirits most familiar to students of demonology are the spirits of vegetation, water spirits, domestic spirits, ancestral spirits, and dream demons. Spirits of vegetation. Blight and crop failures are regarded as the products of evil spirits. Not through the mismanagement of soil, not through committing sin, not through not letting the land rest every 7 years like we're supposed to. It says each vegetable, fruit, tree, shrub, and flower had its own protective spirit and destructive spirit. So presumably, there is a constant enmity between the two spirits, and man must inaugurate the former and protect himself against the latter by making sacrifices, by establishing taboos, and observing strictly such procedures as traditional practice has found effective. They put their effort into appeasing these so-called demons, into doing these things, rather than putting their effort into simply being obedient to the laws of Yahweh. Water spirits, lakes, springs, wells, and streams are supposedly controlled by these spirits for good or evil. Domestic and community spirits, also known as genie, these spirits are believed to serve as protective influences in the home and in the tribal corral. Frequently, serpents are so revered. Did you get that? Frequently, serpents are so revered. The house toad or snake is unmolested because it is accepted as the embodiment of a friendly spirit. The serpent, the snake, is embodied as a friendly spirit. What spirit was it that appeared to Eve? Was it not the serpent who was more subtle and crafty than any beast of the field that Yahweh had made? Associated with this tenet is the belief of widely held in Sweden that a visiting pigeon or dove is a messenger of death. Okay, ancestral spirits. Belief in ancestral spirits and the practice of ancestor worship are widely prevalent. In its cruder forms, this phase of demonology stresses the malignancy of the souls of suicides, of those who die by violence, and of women who died in childbirth. Demons of the unburied are feared more than ordinary ghosts. The worship of ancestral spirits, either as gods or as surviving souls of departed members of the family, reflects belief in immortality, and almost universal belief. That universal belief? See where that belief came from? Universal? That death does not dissolve an individual's relation to the group. Again, go back to what Eve was taught, what Satan was teaching Eve. That thought of, and that teaching of an immortal soul, that the soul will not die. But yet, in Yekeskia, it shows very clearly the soul that sins, it will die, right? Okay. It follows that the living must safeguard themselves against dangerous spirits or demons. Hence, exorcism and charms are superlatively important, wherever this form of demonology prevails. And Pastor shows here, he says, just as we have read from Collier's, these magic rites were used in order to manipulate and appease the demons, the spirits, or the genie, which presided over nature and human affairs. These types of spirits have been addressed: vegetation spirits, water spirits, domestic and community spirits, and ancestral spirits. Now, remember, if you remember, everybody here has read the booklet on why we don't celebrate birthdays, right? And remember, that had to do with the whole, everything that goes behind the birthday celebration is to manipulate and to appease the so-called protective spirit that is over an individual when that individual is born, and that these yearly sacrifices are held, and the parties and the food and the offerings and things like that are made are actually made to appease the spirit, to allow this individual to live for one more year, and it's repeated over and over and over again. So you can see how subtle, you can see how subtle that these things, are embodied, are embedded in these things. It says witchcraft. Witchcraft may be defined for general purposes as the use of supposed supernatural power for antisocial ends. In primitive societies where magic is an accepted part of religious ritual, the witch, which is the unauthorized and especially malevolent practitioner. During the evolution of a monotheistic faith in the Old Testament times, the witches seem to have been those who clung to the old idolatries, the same things that the world is practicing today. It says in the New Testament, the term is commonly equated with the divination practiced by the Romans. Now, witchcraft it shows here, the pastor shows, is simply spoken of those who continued to practice the pagan idolatries. So witchcraft is simply spoken of those who continued to practice pagan idolatries. In the rites and ceremonies practiced at every holiday in Christianity, we find this same witchcraft is invoked. So this Thanksgiving thing that was just had, it's considered witchcraft. Well, what about Christmas? Same thing. Witchcraft. New Year's, Easter, Valentine's Day. All of these things are simply the practicing of witchcraft. And these rites, the ceremonies practiced at every holiday in Christianity, we find the same witchcraft is invoked. And these rites and ceremonies are the same manipulation and appeasement practiced today as in the ancient pagan idolatry of demonism. To the same lords and gods, El, Elohim, Adonai, Allah, Baal, Baal, Asherah, Easter, Ishtar. And this will be made more abundantly clear in the following pages here of this chapter. The rites of the Maypole, the pagan rites of spring. May Day is considered to be just a harmless diversion for the children, and that we see that for all of these holidays. Halloween, well, it's just for the children. What harm is there in decorating their house up and putting a mask on and going from door to door begging for candy? Well, and when they go to the doors, what do they yell? They go, trick or treat. Well, what are they saying? You either give me some candy or I'm going to do something to your house. Okay? They're teaching their children not only God worship, not only this witchcraft, but they're also teaching them extortion. You give me this or else. Extortion, blackmail, however you want to look at it, it's all the same. But it's for the children. Okay. So, however, this abomination was celebrated in Rome for the goddess Flora. Reading in Collier's Encyclopedia, Volume 12, 192, we find this information. May Day, May 1st, the day on which the departure of winter, on which the department of winter and the advent of spring is traditionally observed. May Day probably originated in the pagan rites of spring. In Rome, the day fell when the period of the sacred Flora, the goddess of flowers, when the flower dances and processions were common. May Day was formerly one of England's major festivals, and it continues to be observed in many English towns and villages. In the United States, where for many years May Day was chiefly a festival for children, It is still widely observed in city schools, especially in New York City, and on college and university campuses by the annual appointment of a day, usually later than May 1st, in order to avoid inclement weather, which is celebrated after the old manner by pageants, the erection of maypoles, folk dancing, and singing. In Europe, the Canal Zone, and in the Philippines, and in New York and other large United States cities, May Day is also celebrated as International Labor Day. As this source reference also tells us about this celebration, probably originated in the pagan rites of spring, in order to come to an understanding about just what those pagan rites of spring were, let's read about the Book of Holidays by Walker McSpadden on pages 71 and 72. It says, May Day was the maddest, merriest day of merry England, and it began early. The custom was for everyone to go out into the woods a little after midnight. Okay, so a little after midnight, they'd go out in the woods as to get back by dawn, and they would bring with them the great sprays and branches of the may or hawthorn, a prickly tree with its pink and white blossoms related to the rose. As Alfred Noyes tells us in his ballad, one special prank was for the Lord of Misrule. Now, where have we heard about the Lord of Misrule before? The Lord of Misrule, that's part of the Roman Saturnalia. That's part of the Roman Saturnalia. But the one prank was for the Lord of Misrule and all of his court to come trooping up the aisle of a church where services were being held, dancing and singing, waving garlands high above their heads. But it only wasn't to the church they went. They left flowers at the homes of friends, a custom we still follow in hanging May baskets on the door, and accumulating on the day was the dance around the maypole. And it was no small maypole. It wasn't a little stick in the ground, but this was it says this was no small maypole, but it was a huge and ancient veteran of the forest which took 40 yoke of oxen to transport. And they said getting it into the ground was no easy task, and when it got there, it usually stayed for the whole year until another giant took its place. It says, no holiday has a stronger hold on the people's love of fantasy and spring merrymaking. England was not the place of its origin, although it reached its peak. As have so many festivals, it comes down to us from ancient Rome, from the celebration in honor of Flora, the goddess of flowers and of spring. Children twined garlands around the marble columns of her temple and laid them on the altar. So this is where it all comes from. After making their offerings, they all danced a flower dance, a stately minuet in honor of the goddess of her day. So, you can see that. And like I said, I didn't realize that the Lord of Misrule, had any part in that. If you remember about the Lord of Misrule, that was usually a person that was I think it was like a commoner who was actually appointed to a position of authority, and everybody had to basically obey and do what he said, which was all fine and well, until the Lord of Misrule's end, the end of his rule came, in which he was usually sacrificed and killed. He had his throat cut, in honor of the god Saturn, and that was one count. That was just one count that I read. But you can see how all of these things, they all intertwine, they all tie one right into the other, and it's some of it gets kind of confusing, but what do you expect from a confused world? That's what we get. The laws of Yahweh, we're so blessed to be in Yahweh's house, because there's absolutely nothing confusing about keeping Yahweh's 613 laws. Nothing whatsoever. It's actually, it brings peace, it brings great joy, great health, everything that the world is seeking, but yet they reject. So what we'll do, men, is we'll go ahead and we'll close here. We'll close here on page 206 at the top of the page, and we'll pick up here next week. May Yahweh be with you and bless you.